Imagine for a second that you're sitting at this absolutely massive polished oak table.
Right.
And on one side of this table, you've got a nation that feels, well, completely surrounded by adversaries. They've been historically isolated, and they are just hyper-focused on securing what they see as their ultimate defense.
Right. An unassailable deterrent.
Exactly. And then on the other side of the table, you have this coalition of the world's most powerful nations, and they are, frankly, terrified. They are terrified of what happens if that first nation actually gets its hands on a nuclear weapon.
Because the stakes are literal nuclear weapons.
Right. And here's the kicker. Nobody at this table trusts anyone else. I mean, we're not talking about some minor diplomatic spat here. We are talking about decades of proxy conflicts, covert sabotage, economic warfare.
The history is incredibly dark.
Yeah, it really is. And the entire world, global energy markets, the shipping industries, all the neighboring countries, they're all just watching and holding their breath. Because you have to write a contract that makes everyone feel secure. And you know that just one loophole or, one misinterpretation of a clause could trigger a regional war.
It's basically the ultimate high-wire act of international diplomacy.
Yeah.
I mean, you are trying to engineer trust completely out of thin air.
Yeah.
You're trying to do it with, paper, some international inspectors, and this leaning threat of mutual economic ruin. It's a wild paradox where you're building a security framework on a foundation of absolute total suspicion.
Right. And that is exactly where we're starting today. Welcome to the deep dive. We have got this incredibly dense, very consequential stack of international relations briefings, diplomatic cables, geopolitical analyses right here in front of us.
Quite a stack today.
It is, yeah. And our mission is to completely deconstruct the JCPOA. That's the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which you probably just know as the Iran nuclear deal.
Right, the 2015 agreement.
Exactly. So we're going to track the entire chaotic life cycle of this massive deal. We'll start with its, super optimistic birth back in 2015. Then we'll trace the diplomatic shockwaves when it got disrupted in 2018.
Which is huge.
Huge. And then we're plunging right into the unraveling that happened in 2025. And finally, we're going to pull the camera way back. We need to look at what this entire saga means for major rising powers, specifically how it catches India in this crazy strategic vice grip.
And how it opens a massive door for China.
Yeah, exactly.
And, I really want to stress this right out of the gate. This is not just some niche historical topic about uranium enrichment percentages or some diplomats arguing in Vienna.
No, not at all.
What we are analyzing today is the actual foundation of global energy prices. It's the stability of maritime supply chains. It's the extremely fragile balance of power in West Asia.
Because it's all connected.
Exactly. We're going to see how just one signature on a document or, removing that signature creates physical ripple effects.
Oh.
It literally dictates the cost of fuel at the pump for you.
Right.
It changes how global shipping fleets move.
Yeah.
And it completely alters how a rising power like India tries to keep its strategic autonomy in a multipolar world.
So let's establish the baseline here. We need to go back to 2015 to really look at the anatomy of this deal. The central players are Iran on one side, and on the other, you've got this group known as the P5+1.
Right, the P5+1. So that refers to the 5 permanent veto-wielding members of the UN Security Council.
Yeah.
That's the US, the UK, France, Russia, and China, plus Germany.
Right, and Germany is in there because of their massive economic leverage.
Exactly. They had huge historical trade ties with Iran, so you couldn't really build a functioning sanctions regime without them. But just think about the gravity of that group for a second.
Yeah, it's pretty wild.
In 2015, you had these deep geopolitical rivals. You had the U.S. and Russia, the U.S. and China. And they were willingly sitting on the exact same side of the table.
He just put everything else aside.
They did. They compartmentalized all their other global conflicts because they had this one singular overriding goal, which was stopping Iran from getting a nuclear weapon.
And the mechanism they used for this is what diplomats call a grand bargain. We're talking about a massive foundational trade-off. Basically, Iran agrees to severely restrict, roll back, and delay its nuclear program. And in exchange, the P5+1 agrees to a phased lifting of those crippling international economic sanctions.
The sanctions that had basically completely isolated Iran from the global economy.
Right, but we have to understand the sheer depth of those restrictions, because this wasn't just a handshake and a promise. The P5+1 essentially demanded the physical dismantling of Iran's nuclear infrastructure.
Yeah, it was highly technical.
And there are basically 2 pathways to a bomb, right? You can build one using highly enriched uranium, or you can use weapons-grade plutonium. And the JCPOA tried to block both of those simultaneously.
Let's focus on the uranium pathway, since that's the one that always dominates the headlines. The restrictions here were incredibly specific. It wasn't just a blanket don't build a bomb rule.
Right. They got way into the weeds.
They capped Iran's uranium enriching capacity. They capped the actual level of enrichment allowed. They capped the total stockpiles of low-enriched uranium. And they even restricted the physical centrifuges themselves.
Those are the massive spinning machines they use to enrich the uranium gas, right?
Exactly. And just to put some hard numbers to this, because it shows how strict the deal was. So uranium that you mine from the Earth has less than 1% of the U-235 isotope, which is what you need.
Okay.
To fuel a normal civilian power plant, you only need to enrich it to about 3.67%.
3.67. Got it.
But to build a nuclear weapon, you need to enrich it to roughly 90%. So under the 2015 agreement, Iran was legally capped at that 3.67% civilian level.
So nowhere near weapons grade.
Nowhere near it. And on top of that, their stockpile of that low-enriched uranium was slashed by 98%. They had roughly 10,000 kilograms, and they were capped at just 300 kilograms.
Wow, so down to 300. That's barely enough to even run a power reactor.
Exactly, let alone try to refine it further for a weapon.
Yeah.
And those physical machines, the centrifuges, they had to disconnect thousands of them. They were put into storage under international lock and key.
Right, and they were only allowed to use their oldest, least efficient models, right? The IR-1 centrifuge.
Yes, the IR-1s. And the strategic logic behind all these caps and reductions was completely mathematically driven. It was designed to lengthen what they call the breakout time.
Okay, breakout time. That is a really crucial concept here. Let's make sure we define that clearly.
It really is the defining metric of the whole agreement. Breakout time is the calculated amount of time it would take for Iran to produce enough weapons-grade uranium for exactly one nuclear bomb.
Assuming they just decide to tear up the agreement and dash for a weapon as fast as possible?
Right. And before the 2015 JCPOA, intelligence estimates put Iran's breakout time at just 2 to 3 months.
Wow, so they were right on the threshold.
They were. But by capping the enrichment, slashing those stockpiles, limiting the centrifuges, the JCPOA pushed that breakout time from a couple of months to roughly 1 full year.
Okay, so it buys the international community a 1-year warning window, time to intervene diplomatically or, militarily if Iran decides to break the rules.
Exactly.
But that raises the obvious question, how do you actually know if they're breaking the rules? I mean, going back to our earlier point, nobody trusts anybody here.
Verification is everything.
Right, so let me give you an analogy from the sources that I think explains this perfectly. Imagine you're renting out a house to someone, but based on their history, you are deeply suspicious that they might be running some dangerous, illegal chemical lab in the basement.
Right, a terrible tenant.
Exactly. Now, under a normal lease, you can't just barge in whenever you want. But under the JCPOA agreement, the landlord, which in this case is the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, they don't just have the keys to the front door.
They have the keys to everything.
Every single room, not just the basement, the garage, the attic, the sheds out back. The IAEA can show up entirely unannounced. They conduct rigorous inspections. They take environmental swabs of the walls to test for nuclear particles.
Yeah, the swabbing is incredible.
And they have real-time, tamper-proof cameras everywhere to make sure the tenant isn't doing anything illicit.
That's a brilliant analogy, especially because of what the IAEA calls the additional protocol.
Mm-hmm.
Under this deal, Iran agreed to implement that protocol, which gives inspectors this unprecedented invasive access.
So it wasn't just the famous sites we hear about on the news, like Natanz or Fordo.
Right, exactly. If the IAEA suspected Iran was hiding centrifuge parts in some random warehouse or mining uranium off the books, they had the authority to demand access to those undeclared sites too.
Wow.
The IAEA was really the institutional linchpin of the whole grand bargain. They had to periodically issue formal certifications that Iran was complying with every single technical nuance.
And if they didn't certify it?
If they didn't certify, the economic relief, the lifting of the sanctions, just didn't happen.
So it was this massive, intricate machine of verification. And, for a brief moment in history, this really felt like a monumental triumph of multilateral diplomacy.
It really did.
It seemed like a total validation of the rules-based international order. They had neutralized this massive global security threat without a single shot being fired.
It was geoeconomics in action. They used the massive gravitational pull of the global economy to achieve a security goal. It was a masterpiece of structural compromise.
But as we know, the international system is constantly shifting, and domestic politics rarely stay aligned with international agreements for long.
Which brings us to the disruption.
Right. 2018, the diplomatic shockwave. Because that beautifully constructed rented house analogy we just built, the lease agreement gets completely torn up.
The trigger event here is just seismic. In May 2018, U.S. President Donald Trump makes the unilateral decision to pull the United States completely out of the Iran nuclear deal.
Just unilaterally walks away.
Yes, and it wasn't just a withdrawal on paper. He signed an executive order to immediately reimpose the severe maximum pressure economic sanctions against Iran that had been lifted under the 2015 framework.
Now, looking at the source material, it's crucial we examine the actual arguments coming out of Washington at that time. We need to be impartial here and look at the stated logic. Why walk away from an agreement that the rest of the P5+1 was still totally committed to?
Well, the official positions for the withdrawal were primarily twofold. First, the argument was that the JCPOA just wasn't a permanent fix. It didn't fully end Iran's capability to enrich uranium. It just delayed it.
Right, this is the argument about the sunset clauses.
Exactly. The deal wasn't designed to last forever. Different restrictions had different expiration dates, like some of the caps on advanced centrifuges were set to expire after 10 years.
And the enrichment caps were, what, 15 years?
Yeah, 15 years. So the core argument for the U.S. withdrawal was that these sunset clauses basically just paved a very patient pathway to a bomb.
They were worried Iran would just wait it out.
Right. The perspective was that in a decade or two, Iran would emerge from this deal with a massive, industrially scaled, entirely legal nuclear enrichment infrastructure. And at that point, the world would have zero leverage left to stop them.
Okay, so that's the first argument. The second major argument in the briefings is about the scope of the deal itself. The official U.S. position was that the 2015 agreement totally ignored a parallel threat, Iran's ballistic missile program.
Yes, the delivery systems.
Right. The argument basically was, what good is stopping the development of a nuclear warhead if you're letting them build the intercontinental ballistic missiles designed to carry it? Because the JCPOA focused entirely on the nuclear facilities, it allowed Iran to keep developing conventional missiles and funding regional proxy groups without any restrictions.
So Washington argued the deal was fundamentally, fatally flawed because of that.
And based on those arguments about sunset clauses and missiles, the U.S. pulls out. And the sanctions that snapped back, these were not light symbolic penalties.
No.
These were targeted, basically suffocating chokeholds on the absolute most critical sectors of Iran's economy.
Wow.
The energy sector, the petrochemical sector, and most devastatingly, the financial sector.
Let's really drill down into that financial sector chokehold because it demonstrates just how the U.S. wields global power. The U.S. essentially cut Iranian banks out of the global banking system entirely.
It's basically asymmetric financial warfare.
That's a great way to put it. You have to remember, the U.S. is the central node of the global financial system.
Mm-hmm.
The U.S. dollar is the world's reserve currency.
Right.
So when the U.S. imposes unilateral sanctions on Iran's financial sector, they're weaponizing that centrality. They utilize the SWIFT messaging system.
Wait, SWIFT, that's the network banks use to securely send money across borders, right?
Exactly. They used SWIFT as a tool of foreign policy. It was an aggressive use of unilateral economic power to hit a strategic security objective. And they did it acting entirely outside the framework of the United Nations, or that original P5+1 consensus.
And obviously, the global pushback was immediate and intense. We see in the briefings that former U.S. President Barack Obama, whose administration negotiated the deal, he publicly called the withdrawal a serious mistake. But the really interesting part is looking at the reaction of the U.S. allies.
Yeah, the architectural strain on the international system really shows there.
Because the European allies, the E3, which is Britain, Germany, and France, their reaction was just profound regret and frustration. They had invested immense diplomatic capital into this deal.
They viewed it as a literal pillar of European security architecture.
Right. So on May 8th, 2018, the day of the U.S. withdrawal, the E3 leaders released this highly significant joint statement. They didn't just say they were disappointed. They explicitly called on Iran to remain patient and to keep implementing its nuclear commitments, even though the U.S. just walked away.
And they actually went a step further in that statement. They essentially urged the U.S. administration not to take any action that would prevent them, the European nations, from honoring the agreement.
They were begging the U.S. not to get in their way.
Exactly. They urged the U.S. to do everything possible to preserve the non-proliferation gains of the deal, which really highlights this fascinating legal and institutional crisis.
Yeah, how does that even work legally?
Well, you have a legally binding international agreement. It was formally endorsed by the UN Security Council through Resolution 2231,
Yeah.
and the central architect of that deal, the U.S. just withdraws unilaterally and starts penalizing anyone who tries to stay in it. It severely strains the whole fabric of the rules-based international order.
So the E3 are desperately trying to hold the roof of this building up, and the U.S. just kicked out the main load-bearing pillar.
Precisely. The Europeans even tried to create a special purpose vehicle, this financial mechanism called Instex.
What was Instex supposed to do?
It was supposed to facilitate non-dollar trade with Iran to just bypass the U.S. sanctions entirely. But the chilling effect of the U.S. financial system was just too strong. Global companies were absolutely terrified of American penalties, so they wouldn't use it.
Okay, so the European effort basically stalls out. Now, what does the view look like from Tehran? What was the internal political dynamic in Iran when this withdrawal happened?
Domestically, it was an absolutely crushing blow to the moderate and reformist political factions, specifically to the Iranian president, Hassan Rouhani.
Because he was the one who championed the deal?
He had staked his entire political legacy on this grand bargain. He promised the Iranian people that engaging with the West and making these nuclear concessions would finally bring economic prosperity and end their isolation.
So when the U.S. withdraws and the economic sledgehammer falls again?
His mandate is fundamentally shattered.
But he didn't just instantly tear up the deal on his end, right? The briefings mention he practiced what they called strategic patience.
He did. He declared his government would stay committed to the deal with the remaining powers, Russia, China, the Europeans. But he was backed into a terrible corner.
Right.
He essentially drew a line in the sand. He said Iran was ready to resume industrial-scale uranium enrichment if the remaining parties couldn't deliver the economic benefits and if the new U.S. sanctions crippled their economy.
He was trying to give the Europeans time to save it, but the clock is ticking.
Ticking very loudly. And while he's trying to buy time, his domestic rivals are just seizing the moment.
The hardliners.
The U.S. exit was a massive historic political victory for Iranian hardliners. The conservative factions in the military and the clerical establishment, they had consistently warned Rouhani not to trust the Americans.
They said the West would take the concessions and then just renege on the relief.
Exactly. And suddenly, they are completely politically vindicated in the eyes of the public. So the domestic impact in Iran was this rapid, inevitable shift toward a much harder, more confrontational stance. It was driven by the economic pain and really a deep feeling of national humiliation.
So we end up in this bizarre limbo period. It's a deal without its biggest economic player. The European allies are trying to push this broken car from behind. Iran is in the driver's seat threatening to get out and walk. And the U.S. has walked away with the keys to the global financial system.
It's completely unsustainable.
Completely. And it fundamentally alters the geopolitical landscape. It really demonstrated the sheer unilateral coercive power of the U.S. financial system.
It proved the U.S. could dictate global trade through secondary sanctions, even against its closest allies.
But simultaneously, it sowed the seeds for the total collapse of the agreement down the line. Which brings us to the 2025 crisis, the unraveling.
Right. We fast forward to 2025, and that unsustainable situation finally just shatters. The diplomatic pressure cooker explodes.
Because the maximum pressure campaign meant the U.S. systematically refused to renew any sanctions waivers.
Yeah, the waivers that had allowed some countries to temporarily keep buying Iranian oil, the economic noose just tightened completely.
And Iran's leadership, pushed by those vindicated hardliners, basically declares the reimposition of U.S. sanctions makes the deal null and void.
They argue that since the West failed to uphold its end, the economic relief, Iran had no choice but to abandon its nuclear commitments. So they begin this calculated incremental process of breaking the JCPOA limits step by step.
Which brings us to a crucial timeline in 2025. The briefings highlight a sequence of events that officially bury the agreement. Let's start with April 2025.
In April 2025, we see a final, desperate diplomatic gasp. Indirect negotiations actually resume between Iran and the U.S., mediated by the remaining parties.
Were they trying to resurrect the original deal?
There was an attempt to salvage the situation, maybe negotiate a less-for-less interim agreement, but the trust deficit is absolute at this point. The talks drag on slowly, they face massive domestic hurdles in both Washington and Tehran, and they ultimately yield no final workable agreement.
So the diplomatic channel is technically open, but it's fundamentally stalled, a dead end.
Which leads directly to the critical breaking point in late summer.
August 28, 2025. This is a massive legal and diplomatic maneuver. What exactly happens here?
On August 28, 2025, the European E3, France, Germany, and the UK, they finally lose patience. The diplomatic talks have failed. Iran is creeping closer to a nuclear threshold on the ground. So the E3 trigger what is known as the snapback mechanism.
Okay, let me pause you right there, because the snapback mechanism is a fascinating piece of legal architecture. Explain how this works, because if the E3 want to reimpose UN sanctions on Iran, wouldn't Russia or China, who are friendly with Iran, wouldn't they just use their veto power at the Security Council to block it?
That is exactly the genius and the controversy of the snapback mechanism. When the Obama administration and the P5+1 drafted UN Security Council Resolution 2231 back in 2015, they anticipated this exact problem.
They knew Russia or China might run interference?
Right. They needed a way to punish Iran for cheating without being blocked by a veto, so they created a reverse veto system.
A reverse veto.
Yeah, the snapback mechanism allows any participant state of the JCPOA to notify the Security Council of significant non-performance by Iran.
Okay.
Once that notification is made, the old pre-2015 UN sanctions automatically snap back into place within 30 days, unless the Security Council passes a new resolution to continue lifting them.
So the default action is that the sanctions return.
Yes.
If Russia or China want to protect Iran and keep the sanctions lifted, they have to pass a resolution which the US, UK, or France can then just veto.
It completely flips the traditional UN veto dynamic. It's an incredibly powerful legal trapdoor. By triggering the snapback on August 28, the E3 completely bypassed any potential Russian or Chinese obstruction.
They effectively reimposed the entire regime of previously lifted UN sanctions in direct punitive response to Iran's escalation.
And the Iranian response to that UN snapback was definitive. They didn't back down at all.
Which takes us to October 18th, 2025, Transition Day.
Under the original JCPOA timeline, October 18th was supposed to be the day when the UN officially lifted restrictions on Iran's ballistic missile program and its ability to trade advanced conventional weapons.
But because the snapback had just occurred,
Iran flips the script. On October 18th, Iran makes a monumental official announcement. They formally declare that the restrictions placed upon them under Resolution 2231 have expired in their eyes.
wow.
Iran states formally to the international community that it is no longer bound by any of the curtailed nuclear program provisions.
So they formally declare the constraints are dead, the deal is over, and they escalate. The physical reality on the ground in 2025 shifts dramatically and dangerously.
It does. Having shed the political constraints, Iran begins enriching uranium to higher levels than were ever permitted under the old deal. We start seeing enrichment levels hitting 60%.
And 60% is a really critical number, right? Because to a layperson, 60% sounds like it's still pretty far from the 90% needed for a weapon. But the physics of enrichment means they are actually incredibly close at that point.
Exactly. Because of the way separative work units function, that's the effort required to separate the isotopes. Getting from natural 1% up to 20% takes massive effort.
Right.
Getting from 20% to 60% takes less effort. And going from 60% to that 90% weapons-grade threshold is a very short, highly technical leap.
So Iran at 60% enrichment is essentially maintaining a latent nuclear weapons capability.
They are hovering right on the threshold.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just the enrichment levels, it's the hardware.
Yeah.
They aren't using those old, slow IR-1 centrifuges anymore.
Right. They moved on to the advanced ones.
They are installing and cascading advanced centrifuges, the IR-6s, the IR-8s. These newer machines can enrich uranium far faster, far more efficiently, and in a much smaller physical footprint.
Which completely changes the math on that breakout time we talked about earlier.
Absolutely. The original breakout time of 1 year, it has shrunk drastically.
Yeah.
We are no longer talking about a year.
Yeah.
We're talking about weeks, potentially days, to produce enough fissile material for a weapon.
The strategic environment has rapidly degraded into just high alert volatility.
And remember our rented house analogy from the beginning, with the IAEA landlord meticulously checking every room with their keys.
Yeah.
Here is the most terrifying detail from the 2025 intelligence briefings. The IAEA is raising massive alarms globally. They are warning the world about receding access and a severe lack of cooperation from Iran.
So the monitoring and verification architecture, the very foundation of the trust we talked about, is blinding.
The institutional safeguards have completely collapsed. Iran began turning off the IAEA's surveillance cameras. They removed the real-time enrichment monitors. They denied access to key inspectors.
So the landlord's keys no longer work, the cameras are physically disconnected, And the tenant is basically operating the laboratory entirely in the dark.
The IAEA Director General literally referred to it as a black hole of intelligence.
Let's synthesize this incredibly grim 2025 reality. The entire JCPOA framework, that grand bargain of 2015, is in complete structural collapse.
Welcome collapse.
Iran is moving rapidly toward nuclear threshold status, operating advanced centrifuges in the dark. Heavy economic sanctions, both the unilateral American ones and the multilateral UN snapbacks, are fully reimposed, and diplomatic negotiations have entirely stalled out.
It's the absolute worst-case scenario envisioned by diplomats a decade prior. We've entered a highly volatile phase of nuclear latency combined with aggressive economic warfare. The whole region is a tinderbox.
So what does this all actually mean outside the halls of the UN? How does this massive geopolitical failure physically impact the rest of the world?
That's where we have to look at the broader map.
Let's look at a rising global power. With a booming economy, a massive population, sitting right across the Arabian Sea from this unfolding crisis. Let's talk about India.
The implications for India are profound, and they are incredibly dangerous. India's strategic dilemma here is how to navigate a rapidly growing, energy-hungry economy through an absolute geopolitical minefield.
Right.
When we analyze India's position in the source material, we have to evaluate it through several interconnected lenses: energy security, regional maritime stability, the contagion effect of secondary sanctions, and India's overall strategic positioning.
Let's start with energy security because that is the most immediate, visceral impact. India has historically had a very significant, very beneficial energy trade relationship with Iran.
It's vital. India is the third largest energy consumer in the world, and they are heavily reliant on imported crude oil to fuel their economic growth. Before the sanctions hit, Iran was one of India's top suppliers.
And it wasn't just about the sheer volume of oil, was it?
No, Iranian crude is uniquely beneficial to India. It's often heavier crude, which many of the Indian refineries on the western coast were specifically calibrated and built to process.
Oh, interesting.
Furthermore, Iran historically offered India highly favorable credit terms, cheap freight rates, and this is key, they were even willing to accept payment in Indian rupees rather than U.S. dollars.
Which is huge for India because it helps them conserve their foreign exchange reserves.
Exactly. So when these sanctions drop and the U.S. demands that Iranian oil exports go to zero, it directly threatens India's economic engine. Prolonged sanctions and the renewed heavy restrictions we see locked in by 2025, they directly threaten India's access to this vital energy node.
Because for India, maintaining diverse sources of energy is literally a matter of national security.
It is. When Iranian oil is forcefully taken off the market or made incredibly difficult and legally perilous to purchase, it violently disrupts Indian energy diversification plans. It forces India to scramble.
They have to look elsewhere. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, maybe the U.S. itself.
Right, but potentially at higher prices, without those favorable credit terms. And that directly impacts domestic inflation, the national deficit, and overall economic stability in India.
And beyond just the physical barrels of oil, there is the massive issue of regional stability and supply chains. Because a more militarized Iran, feeling backed into a corner by sanctions, or worse, a nuclear-capable Iran that triggers an arms race in the Middle East, massively raises the instability in West Asia.
And India is uniquely vulnerable to that specific geographic instability. India is deeply reliant on maritime trade routes that run directly through the Indian Ocean, the Arabian Sea, and critically, the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz.
Right, roughly 20% of the world's oil passes through the Strait of Hormuz.
Exactly. If the balance of power shifts, or if Iran decides to retaliate against sanctions by harassing commercial shipping, the risks for India spike dramatically. We are talking about severe, immediate risks to vital shipping lanes, port operations.
And massive increases in maritime insurance premiums, I imagine.
Oh, crippling increases for any cargo moving near the Gulf. It threatens the entire supply chain architecture.
But here is where it gets incredibly tricky for a country like India, and we really need to unpack this carefully. We mentioned sanctions earlier, but the briefings specifically focus on sanctions contagion, specifically secondary sanctions.
Secondary sanctions are the real weapon here.
Let me push back on the basic logic here because I think it confuses a lot of people. If the U.S. government sanctions the Iranian government, why does a private Indian bank in Mumbai or an Indian shipping company operating out of Gujarat get in trouble? They aren't American entities. They don't operate under U.S. law.
That is the pivotal question of modern geoeconomics. It really comes down to the extraterritorial reach of U.S. financial power. Let's break down the exact mechanism because it's brilliant and ruthless.
Okay.
Primary sanctions mean U.S. companies, U.S. citizens, and U.S. banks cannot do business with Iran. That's standard.
Right, that makes sense.
Secondary sanctions are different. Secondary sanctions mean the U.S. government tells the rest of the world, you have a choice. You can either do business with Iran or you can do business with the United States financial system. You cannot do both.
Uh, and because the U.S. economy is so massive and the U.S. dollar is the global reserve currency, almost all international trade eventually touches the American financial system.
Exactly. Let's say an Indian refinery wants to buy Iranian oil, they have to pay for it.
Yeah.
If the Indian bank processing that payment uses the SWIFT network or clears the transaction through a correspondent bank in New York, the U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, can track it.
Okay, and if OFAC sees it?
If OFAC designates that Iranian transaction as sanctionable, they can penalize the Indian bank. They can literally cut that Indian bank off from the U.S. financial system, preventing them from doing business in dollars ever again.
Wow. And for a major international bank, being cut off from the dollar is basically a death sentence.
Precisely. So it's not that the U.S. is sending police to arrest Indian bankers. They are simply threatening to exile them from the global economy.
This creates a massive chilling effect, doesn't it?
A massive one. Even if a specific trade, like food or medicine, is technically exempt from sanctions, global banks engage in what's called overcompliance.
They just refuse to touch anything related to Iran.
Exactly. They refuse to process any transactions related to Iran simply because the regulatory risk of a U.S. penalty is just too high. So Indian companies and banks are deterred from engaging with Iran because the economic penalty of secondary sanctions is existential.
Which severely limits India's diplomatic leverage and its sovereign trade policies.
It's a mechanism that forces compliance far beyond U.S. borders. It dictates the foreign policy of allied and neutral nations alike.
Which leads directly into the broader issue of geopolitical positioning. Because India has long prided itself on a foreign policy doctrine of strategic autonomy.
Right, they want to chart their own course.
They want balanced, productive relations with the U.S., with Iran, with the Gulf Arab states, and with Russia simultaneously.
But the collapse of the JCPOA, the aggressive posture of Iran, and the uncompromising imposition of these secondary sanctions forces a stark polarization. A complete breakdown in talks and a hardline U.S. stance forces India into an incredibly uncomfortable corner.
They basically have to pick sides.
India wants to build a deep strategic partnership with the U.S. Think of the QAA alliance in the Indo-Pacific to counter China. But maintaining that relationship while the U.S. is demanding total isolation of Iran makes maintaining historical and energy ties with Tehran nearly impossible.
It deeply undermines that prized strategic autonomy.
It forces a zero-sum calculation onto India's foreign policy, a with us or against us dynamic that New Delhi historically despises.
Let's ground this abstract geopolitical maneuvering in a very specific, tangible example from the briefings. Connectivity and corridor projects.
This is perhaps where the sanctions hurt India's long-term grand strategy the most. Let's look at the Chabahar port project.
Chabahar.
Yes. Chabahar is a seaport in southeastern Iran, strategically located outside the volatile Strait of Hormuz. India invested heavily in developing this port.
Why? What's the strategic value for India?
Because it is the anchor of the India-Iran-Afghanistan corridor and a key node in the International North-South Transport Corridor, or INSTC.
Right, because if India wants to send goods to Afghanistan or to the massive markets of Central Asia and eventually Russia, they currently have a major geographic problem. Pakistan is in the way.
And Pakistan blocks Indian overland transit.
Yeah.
Chabahar port allows India to bypass Pakistan entirely. Goods can be shipped from Mumbai across the Arabian Sea to Chabahar in Iran, and then transported via Iranian railways north into Afghanistan and Central Asia. It is a brilliant strategic and logistical workaround.
But I'm guessing these massive infrastructure projects only reap benefits if Iran is economically stable and sanction-free.
Exactly. Because of the secondary sanctions, the financing freezes up. International engineering firms won't supply cranes for the port. Global shipping lines refuse to dock there for fear of OFAC penalties.
So the current 2025 stalemate and the heavy sanctions severely delay these critical linkages.
It essentially stalls India's entire connectivity strategy for Central Asia. leaving their investments stranded and their strategic goals unfulfilled.
So we have a situation where India's core interests in the region, its vital energy needs, the maritime security of its trade routes, its prized strategic autonomy, and its multi-billion-dollar connectivity corridors, they are all suffering immense collateral damage as a direct result of the JCPOA's collapse.
India is caught in this massive, suffocating web of secondary sanctions, trying desperately to walk a tightrope without falling into the abyss.
And here is where the global chessboard shifts dramatically. Because while one superpower, the United States, is utilizing aggressive financial sanctions to try and isolate Iran and starve it of capital, another superpower recognizes a massive strategic vacuum.
And they are swooping in with a massive checkbook, a long-term vision, and an absolute disregard for American sanctions.
Enter the dragon.
Yes.
The source material outlines a monumental, game-changing shift in the geopolitical landscape. China and Iran have signed a 25-year strategic cooperation pact.
And the scope of this agreement is just breathtaking. We are not just talking about a simple bilateral trade deal where they agree to lower tariffs on pistachios and electronics.
This is much bigger.
The text of the pact explicitly states it is a comprehensive framework encompassing deep political, economic, and strategic components. It establishes a massive blueprint for reciprocal long-term investments.
What kind of numbers are we talking about?
We are looking at a commitment of hundreds of billions of dollars in sustained Chinese investment into the absolute core of the Iranian state, modernizing Iranian transport networks, expanding massive port facilities along the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman, upgrading energy infrastructure, funding domestic industry, and integrating telecommunications networks.
And we absolutely have to view this through the lens of everything we just discussed regarding the 2018 withdrawal and the 2025 collapse. Because this pact is not happening in a vacuum.
Not at all.
It is a direct, defiant push by Beijing to financially support and integrate Iran precisely at the moment when Tehran is under the crushing, suffocating weight of the reinstated U.S. sanctions.
It is the ultimate countermove in modern geoeconomics. While the West, led by the U.S., utilizes the global banking system to isolate Iran and starve its economy into submission, China is stepping in to integrate Iran deeply into its own rapidly expanding economic sphere.
And this isn't an isolated policy either. This 25-year pact forms a crucial geographic pillar of China's broader grand strategy, right? The Belt and Road Initiative, or the BRI.
Yes, the BRI. This is China's trillion-dollar global plan to fund infrastructure projects, ports, railways, highways, pipelines across Asia, Africa, and Europe, massively increasing Chinese geopolitical influence and securing supply lines back to the mainland.
Think about the analogy we used earlier, about the U.S. using its control of the global financial system as a gravitational force to hold its secondary sanctions in place. This Chinese-Iranian pact is essentially China building an alternate economic universe where U.S. sanctions simply have no gravity.
That is exactly what it is. If Iran can trade its vast oil reserves directly with China and in return receive massive infrastructure investment utilizing Chinese state capital, Chinese construction firms, and Chinese technology, the isolation intended by the U.S. sanctions is fundamentally broken.
And they structure these deals to bypass the U.S. dollar entirely, don't they?
That's the key. They might settle oil trades in the Chinese yuan, often referred to as the petroyuan, or they use alternative payment clearing systems like China's CIPS instead of the Western-dominated SWIFT network.
So the secondary sanctions lose their teeth entirely.
The U.S. cannot sanction a transaction it cannot see and does not control.
This fundamentally reshapes the balance of power in West Asia. It directly and immediately complicates the strategic interests of the U.S., obviously, because it blunts their primary non-military coercive tool. But think about what this means for India, connecting it directly back to our previous segment.
It is a massive, multi-front strategic challenge for India. Consider the geography. India is trying to painstakingly build its own limited connectivity to Central Asia via Iran's Chabahar port, while constantly tiptoeing around U.S. sanctions to avoid getting its banks penalized.
Meanwhile, China, India's primary geopolitical rival, with whom it shares a tense militarized border, is laying down a 25-year sanction-proof blueprint for comprehensive dominance of Iranian infrastructure.
China is securing the very access and influence that India is being locked out of. If China develops ports in Iran, like the proposed port at Chas just outside the Strait of Hormuz, they establish a strategic foothold right on the vital shipping lanes that fuel India's economy.
It exacerbates India's technology and supply chain vulnerabilities.
As the traditional Western-led frameworks of global trade weaken, and the world rapidly moves toward a polarized multipolarity, securing reliable, sanction-proof partnerships becomes vital. The China-Iran pact tightens the Sino-Iranian axis.
It potentially restricts India's strategic, diplomatic, and economic space in West Asia.
It directly complicates India's broader vision of a free, open, and balanced Indo-Pacific. Furthermore, it directly challenges India's domestic economic goals of self-reliance, or Atmanirbhar, by increasing the entire region's reliance on Chinese infrastructure, Chinese technological standards, and Chinese capital.
India is basically watching its western flank being slowly enveloped by its eastern rival, facilitated by the fallout of Western sanctions.
Exactly.
What an incredible, sprawling journey this has been. Let's synthesize everything we've unpacked today. We started with the tentative optimism of that 2015 agreement in Vienna, the P5+1, and Iran crafting a grand bargain, utilizing the IAEA as the ultimate landlord to trade nuclear rollback for economic integration.
And then we traced the disruptive shock of 2018, when the U.S. unilaterally withdrew, citing sunset clauses and ballistic missiles.
And reimposed crippling secondary sanctions that terrified the global banking system and undermined Iranian moderates.
And we followed that timeline into the abyss of 2025. We saw diplomacy entirely stall out by April. We saw the E3 desperately utilize the brilliant yet controversial legal trapdoor of the UN snapback mechanism in August, bypassing a Russian veto to reimpose global sanctions.
And we saw Iran's definitive retaliation in October, declaring the UN constraints expired, blinding the IAEA inspectors, and rapidly cascading advanced IR-6 centrifuges to push enrichment levels to a terrifying 60%.
The institutional architecture completely collapsed.
And then we pulled the camera back. We saw how this shift from a technical debate about separative work units and centrifuges morphed into a massive geopolitical chessboard. We saw India caught in a vice grip, facing a crisis of energy security, terrified of secondary sanction contagion, watching its multi-billion-dollar connectivity corridors in Chabahar stall out, and struggling to maintain its strategic autonomy.
And simultaneously, we saw China execute a massive strategic pivot, utilizing its Belt and Road Initiative to sign a 25-year pact with Iran, creating a sanction-proof economic ecosystem and fundamentally redrawing the balance of power in West Asia right under the nose of Washington and New Delhi.
The ultimate takeaway here, the so what for anyone trying to understand modern geopolitics, is the sheer inescapable interconnectedness of the global system.
A single sunset clause debated in a UN resolution back in 2015, or a single advanced centrifuge spinning in an underground facility in Natanz today does not exist in a vacuum.
It eventually, inevitably, dictates the price of crude oil for a refinery in Gujarat. It impacts the cost of maritime shipping insurance in the Persian Gulf. It drives the financing and construction of massive continent-spanning infrastructure corridors across Asia.
It proves that in international relations, every single action, every withdrawal, every sanction forces an equal and often unpredictable reaction.
Which brings us right back to that massive polished oak table we visualized at the very beginning of the show. We talked about the incredible difficulty of trying to engineer trust using economic sanctions and invasive inspections. But looking at where we ultimately ended up in the fallout of 2025, I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder based on everything we've uncovered today.
It's perhaps the most critical question for the future of global diplomacy and statecraft.
If the ultimate result of unilaterally isolating a sovereign nation with the heaviest, most crippling economic sanctions in history is that they simply turn around, accelerate their nuclear program in the dark, and sign a 25-year comprehensive strategic pact with your primary geopolitical rival, it raises a massive foundational question.
It really does.
In today's highly connected multipolar world, do unilateral economic sanctions still work the way they used to compel behavior and bring adversaries to the table? Or do they now simply force your adversaries into each other's arms, effectively redrawing the global map and diluting the very financial power you relied upon? Think about that as you watch the news this week. We will see you next time on The Deep Dive.